Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon, this morning, this evening, tonight, wherever you happen to be. My name is Kathy Fitzpatrick, and I'm a professor and director of the Zimmerman School at the University of South Florida. And I have the honor of introducing our panel of experts today on public diplomacy in Latin America and moderating today's event. But before we get started, I want to recognize our hosts for this program, and that would be the Center on Public Diplomacy and the Public Diplomacy Interest Group of the International Communication Association. So thanks to both of you for getting this group together and hosting this great event. And so now to the show. Today, we are going to consider the state of public diplomacy in Latin America and discuss public diplomacy strategies that have had significant impacts across the region. The panelists, will explore the transformative role of digital media and technology and other media in public diplomacy and offer us kind of a firsthand view of how such advancements are reshaping interactions on a global scale. So let me introduce our panel of experts. First, we have Dr. Vanessa Bravo, professor and director of the Strategic Communication Department at Elon University in North Carolina. Before transitioning into academia, Dr. Bravo worked for 15 years in Costa Rica as a journalist, editor, and strategic communication professional. She is a former Fulbright scholar, and she is the co-editor of the book, Latin American Diasporas in Public Diplomacy. And I just have to add here that book is a volume in the Palgrave Macmillan Global Public Diplomacy book series, for which I serve as co-editor, along with fellow CPD faculty fellow, Vivian Walker. Today, Dr. Bravo is going to focus on public diplomacy and migration. Her presentation analyzes the mobilization efforts, protests, and strategic communication tactics of Central American migrants from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador to fight against blockades placed by Mexico in recent years to impede crossings into the United States. Gerardo Diaz Bartolome, forgive me if I didn't get that just quite right, is the Director of Strategic Communication and Public Diplomacy and the spokesperson for the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He formerly served in the Argentine Embassy in the United States and Argentina's permanent mission to the United Nations. Today, Jerry will talk about his current role as it is an exciting, I think, new post in the foreign ministry and how this new position reflects the importance and relevance of public diplomacy. He also will share a brief account of Argentina's prior public diplomacy strategies and consider their plans for the future, including in the area of digital diplomacy. Dr. Pablo Morales is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. Prior to transitioning into academia, he was a journalist and translator for China Radio International and People's Daily Online in Beijing. Dr. Morales' research examines the impact of globalization on international media flows and journalistic cultures in the Global South, with particular focus on China and Latin America. Today, he will discuss the role of local media in China's public diplomacy strategy in Latin America and consider how Beijing is strengthening its partnerships with local media organizations to maximize the reach of public diplomacy efforts in the region. So that's the lineup. Following the panelists' presentations, we will engage in a moderated Q&A, and then we'll open for discussion and questions with the audience. And I know that some of you have already sent in some terrific questions, so we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So let's begin with you, Vanessa.
Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. Thank you to the organizers of the panel, and thank you, Dr. Kathy Fitzpatrick, for this kind introduction. I conduct research in the field of transnational strategic communications in connection to the processes of international migration. My main area of research is government diaspora communications, or in other words, the strategic communication processes by which home governments in countries such as Mexico, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Colombia try to establish and maintain positive relationships with their diaspora communities, especially among migrants who relocate to the United States, which is the main host country that I study. Public diplomacy and how governments and diasporas contribute to public diplomacy efforts is another area of emphasis of my research. As most of you know, public diplomacy is traditionally defined as strategic communications and actions led by nation states to engage publics located abroad. However, contemporary scholars agree that non-state actors, including businesses, nonprofits, and diaspora communities, can collaborate with or even lead strategic communications efforts that also engage publics located outside of the home country. These strategic communication efforts can support home state goals, such as when a government at home and a diaspora group agree on some issues and work together to advance similar goals. But public diplomacy efforts by diaspora groups can also oppose the goals of the state at home in what has been called dissent public diplomacy. This is part of what Dr. Maria de Moya, who works at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, but at the time was working at DePaul University in Chicago, and I explored when we co-edited in early fall of 2021 the book Latin American Diasporas in Public Diplomacy that Dr. Fitzpatrick mentioned before, where we present case studies of public diplomacy efforts involving diaspora communities, either as supporters or as adversaries of their home governments. We are proud of this book because it is the first one of its type that it's centered on diasporas from Latin America, but also because all of the authors that contributed to this edited volume are Latin American scholars, and most of them members of their diaspora communities as well. So let me take the opportunity. This is the book. We have 13 chapters in the book, and we have cases from Mexico, Guatemala, Bolivia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Argentina, Chile, Cuba, Puerto Rico, let's see, Brazil, Venezuela, and then there are other chapters that come back to cases in Mexico and Brazil, because those are very important countries in this field. And if you were interested in this book or in getting to get any of the chapters or something like that, if you send me an email, I'll be glad to communicate with you. My email is vbravo@elon. But anyways, I also study the types of messages that governments send, and here I mean content that is communicated through official websites, formal speeches, social media posts, press conferences, etc., about their diasporas, and also messages to their diasporas. In other words, I study how governments talk about diaspora members and what messages they communicate to them. My research then contributes to the understanding of how the bonds between governments and diaspora groups are created and fortified or damaged in some cases, and how strategic communications play a role in that relationship building process, not only to communicate to or about the diaspora, but also to construct the image of the diaspora and to court the diaspora, as in flirting with, if you wish, diaspora communities to win their support. The case of Mexico has always interested me very particularly because it is a pioneer in Latin America in public diplomacy efforts to engage its diaspora community, and because it is a government that has offered clear messages to their diaspora members, including about the fact that their human rights matter, not only in Mexico, but while in transit and in host countries such as the United States. So I have been an admirer of Mexico and the strength that public diplomacy efforts and policies have in that country. For that reason, I am now interested in studying and surprised by, honestly, a situation that has developed in the last years in Mexico and in other countries around the world too, and especially in the last 12 months. As I said, migrants sending countries like Mexico have made the defense of their migrants' human rights in host countries a central part of their public diplomacy goals. However, more recently, it appears that some migrant sending countries, even those who send migrants away the most, can see migrants from third countries as disruptors or as problems or as threats. In transit migrants in Mexico, for instance, migrants from Central America, but more and more also migrants from Venezuela, from Haiti, from Cuba, and even from West Africa and China, feel sometimes forced to push back, to protest, to disrupt, and to create public diplomacy and reputational challenges that affect the countries where they find themselves at while in transit. Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians, and Central American migrants, especially those from El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, are trying to fight against the blockades that Mexico has placed in recent years to impede them to cross to the United States. Migrants, in return, are protesting at the two borders of Mexico, both in the north and the south, in front of the US Embassy in Mexico City, sometimes blocking bridges in border towns in some occasions. Even there was one protest where they were sewing their mouths with actual needles to call attention to their situation, and other ways of protesting. The blocking efforts by Mexico were requested, promoted, and supported by the United States, by the Trump administration first, with the program of Remaining Mexico, but they have also continued during the Biden government as well. Mexico has agreed, for example, to receive back each month 30,000 asylum seekers from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, who cross to the United States irregularly and whom the US wants to expel from its territory. And Mexico has also agreed to collaborate with US personnel in Mexico to increase enforcement of its south border, to stop migrants from passing through Mexico, and to increase deportations of migrants captured within Mexico. This is, I think, very concerning from a human rights standpoint in general, but also from a public diplomacy perspective. Because how can Mexico portray itself as a human rights defender when all of this is happening? Let me just mention that these processes have been described by scholars such as sociologist David Fitzgerald and others as a phenomenon that they called externalization of the border. Externalization, in very simple terms, describes the efforts of wealthy, developed countries to prevent asylum seekers and other migrants from reaching their borders, often by enlisting third countries or private entities. Although less visible than physical barriers at international borders, externalization controls or restricts mobility in ways that are out of sight and far from the country's border. Examples include visa restrictions, sanctions for carriers who transport asylum seekers, and agreements with source and in-transit countries. Consequences often include increased irregular migration, human smuggling, and people dying at the border. So I'm just in the data collection stage at this point, but that's a topic that is calling my attention right now very much for the implications it has. It's happening in the case of the United States, engaging Mexico in these practices and Colombia in these practices, but it's also happening around the world. It's happening in Australia, in Canada, the European Union, the United Kingdom. Italy, for example, is kind of outsourcing the immigration control by giving resources to Libya and Tunisia, which are countries that don't have the best human rights indicators. Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus has said that he's going to flood Poland with immigrants on their way to Germany if he doesn't get more resources. And again, in Latin America, Mexico and Colombia seem to be targets of the US in this topic. So I was given 10 minutes, 10 minutes just finished. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Now we're going to move on to Jerry.
Thank you very much for organizing this event and having me as your guest. It's a big pleasure to share my experience with so many colleagues, scholars who study what we do. As Kathy very graciously said, the purpose of my presentation today, I'm a career diplomat, so is to tell you what we are in Argentina's foreign ministry are doing these days as far as public diplomacy is concerned, because news is that we have just created a specific department to deal with strategic communication and public diplomacy. That's the title of my new position. Not because we have not done that in the past, but not as institutionalized and organized as we're aiming to do at this stage. As you may be aware, we have a new government in Argentina. December the 10th, the new president took office. We have a new foreign minister, and we have been working on the structure, the whole organizational chart of the ministry, and the former direction or Department of Press has been renamed as the Strategic Communication and Public Diplomacy Department. And why? Well, the very name is very powerful. As I said, it's not that we had not been doing public diplomacy before. We diplomats sometimes do it intuitively without knowing that we are actually carrying out public diplomacy. We started as early as in 2010 in Argentina's foreign ministry with the use of social media as the main tool for public diplomacy, in addition to the traditional means that, exchanges, student exchanges and cultural diplomacy. But it was only in 2016 that we set up our first office of public diplomacy as a separate unit within the cabinet of the minister. And they carried out and developed the first attempt to institutionalize and set the standards for us career diplomats to follow in our initiatives of public diplomacy, mainly abroad. So the idea was to centralize the standards, the protocols for use, and give us like the main input for the main campaigns and materials that we were expected to disseminate, and leave the embassies and the consulates room enough to develop their own materials, ideas, and messages regarding and taking, of course, into account the specific audience where those embassies or consulates are located. So at this stage, we felt the need to have a more powerful, robust, and centralized department. And we see that both public diplomacy and strategic communication as two disciplines that go hand in hand and are indispensable tools for countries and organizations seeking to engage, and that's the key word, to engage in conveying the message that foreign policy wants to convey, as opposed to traditional diplomatic means. So I usually play I'm a big fan of many scholars, but I remember Nick Kalnow, and he always mentions his 5 elements in his taxonomy of public diplomacy. Well, we decided to go a little bit further and add the 6th one, that some other scholar had mentioned, the strategic communication part of the name, together with the public diplomacy component. So basically my job, I will use the 3 typical fields of what, why, and how to explain what, why, and how we will do it. So the what is the goal to revamp and enhance Argentina's public diplomacy initiatives, which had been in place for a while now. I had the chance to be involved while I was posted abroad, particularly in Washington, where we had a very active presence in social media and cultural diplomacy and many initiatives dealing with public diplomacy, which is a field not so easy for diplomats to grasp, because you are expected as a diplomat to engage with official audiences, government to government communication, which is most of our job. But not only that part of our job, because we are expected to engage with local audiences, be it the academia, social media, be it the think tanks, be it cultural entities and people. So we are expected to convey our foreign policy goals, not only to government or the White House while I was posted in Washington, or the State Department, but to engage with local American communities and explain what Argentina was actually seeking in foreign policy and what our objectives were. So that is basically the what, to come up with a revamped department to enhance public diplomacy within the strategic communication field. The why is because we felt the need to make it stronger as a department, to more centralized, of course, leaving the necessary autonomy for the rest of our embassies and all our network of representations abroad, and the need to promote more engagement on the part of our embassies and consulates, not only with Argentines abroad, which is perhaps the most, I would say, the easiest example with diasporas, as Vanessa was talking. It's easier for you as a diplomat to engage with your own diaspora abroad than perhaps with the local audience, local people. So the main objective is to have a more active and engaging attitude. And taking, of course, into account the critical role of culture, education, and the traditional diplomatic messages. And the how, well, the idea is to, again, have review and set up all the necessary protocols for us career diplomats to be aware of what our duties are, but also which our responsibilities and limitations are. Because as a career diplomat, you cannot do whatever you do, perhaps as an individual while you're interacting in social media, because you are representing your country at every time. So it's a full-time 24/7 hour job. And we are also working with our future diplomats in the Argentine Academy, Diplomatic Academy. We are organizing some specific courses to give the necessary information and inputs to our future diplomats, because most of them are, of course, very young. So they are what we call digital natives. But we, perhaps like me, digital immigrants, have perhaps more experience so that they can work on their natural, and I would say, it's a natural and native attitude in favor of social media, but they still need some training to know how to handle certain messages, what information should be passed and how. The main challenge, I would say, for a diplomat is to know how to engage, because we have a tendency not to interact for sensitive issues, or not to interact because you actually are of a certain rank within the structure of diplomacy and you need someone else's authorization to go online. But the main challenge has to do that you are not used to interacting with a different audience from the official government to government channel. You're not used to working with the digital means as your usual means, because it's a face-to-face business, diplomacy. And lastly, the language, because when you develop public diplomacy strategies, the language needs to be different from the very formal language we diplomats use in our daily communication with other diplomats. So basically, I don't want to go beyond my 10 minutes. That it would be the very main part of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And now we'll move on, please, to Pablo.
Hello, thank you very much. If you just bear with me just for 1 second, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I've prepared just a few slides to help to guide you on during my presentation. The last two speakers were mostly covering what efforts are being done from the region in Latin America. My perspective is much from the outsider. So what is the role of, what is China doing in the region? But I will circle back to actors in Latin America to see how local media in the region are being contacted and are partnered up with some of Chinese media, and how that also helps not just Chinese PD efforts, but also Latin Americans. So I will start by giving you a brief presentation of Chinese public diplomacy and how it is articulated through one of the main pillars of public diplomacy, which is international media. And in the case of China, this is very natural because they argue that the image of China is around the world is mostly negative due to a bias from particular Western media that present China as a demon, present China as a threat in all sorts of segments in politics, in the economy, and they also talk about China as a regime that doesn't have any future and is going to collapse at any moment. So having that in mind, Chinese media are trying to counter those hegemonic narratives and negative narratives about China and trying to portray China as a peaceful country, as a responsible global power, as a country that is emerging and is treating every other country fairly. So that is what they're trying to do. And in the case of Latin America, they have been articulating this strategy by very similarly of what they do in other parts of the world, through a plethora of different platforms, from news agencies to radio, to television, but also online, and also magazines that are being printed even in, for example, the magazine China Today is being printed in Mexico, the Spanish version, and there's also a Portuguese version. So all these different media have services in Spanish at least, and some of them even in Portuguese. But they have one big problem, is that they have to catch the attention of Latin Americans. And if we think of the case of Spanish speakers in Latin America and in the world in general, they have to compete with a lot of different, not just local media, but also international media there. So they, by following this strategy of developing their own media to get their own discourse and engage audiences in Latin America, they are encountering a lot of limitations. Why? Because I conducted quite a few focus groups in Mexico and Argentina, and the sense was that barely anyone even knew that these media existed. So if they don't exist, then people are not going to really understand. The messages are being sent to practically no one. Another issue was credibility. So the journalism and journalistic style and tradition in China is quite different, because the regime, the political system is also very different. And that was seen and perceived as quite negative, and that was undermining the credibility of these media organizations in the region. And other limitations had to do with cultural differences, for example, the language that they were using. Now, having or being aware of those limitations, what China has been doing in the last few years is partnering up with local media throughout the region. So this is just a few examples of what they have been doing. So China Media Group, which is China Radio International and also television, they have been partnering up with different media organizations throughout the continent, from Brazil to Argentina. And they produce different programs or segments within those within different programs to present China on their own ways, by using their own sources. So just the example of the case of Brazil, there's a segment on news about China, which is about 10 minutes. Is presented by both Brazilian and Chinese presenters. And the news have to do with China, but not just in China, also news about China in Brazil. For example, during the pandemic, part of the vaccine diplomacy, or even other aspects that have to do, for example, with Chinese culture in Brazil. For example, Spring Festival or anything that has to do with the country as well. So this strategy of partnering up with local media is helping at least to diversify the image that viewers in this case of Brazil, but in other countries as well, are getting about China. So they can start perceiving the country in a different way. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. This new strategy is being developed quite strongly, and they have even signed an agreement with the Alianza Informativa Latinoamericana, which is an alliance of many broadcasters from different countries, at least around 20 countries in the world, including as well the US and Spain, and that share content. And in the case of China, whenever they need news about China, because if you imagine many broadcasters or most broadcasters and media organizations in Latin America don't have any correspondence in China, so they can get access to content that has been produced by Chinese media, and they can show that to their viewers. If you're interested, there's a book that just came out written by Igor Patrick, who is a Brazilian journalist, and he goes into a lot of detail in telling all this, talking about all these different agreements and what that means for the region, and how that impacts other parts of the discussions in Latin America as well. Now, what I think you find very interesting here is that these collaborations contribute to diversify and reframe China's image in Latin America, but what's interesting to discuss is how reciprocal are they, and how do they advance the public diplomacy efforts from Latin American countries. And I find it really interesting because some of these partnerships, and I give you two examples here, have developed into something that is mutually beneficial. For example, in the case of Argentina, during the G20 back in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, CCTV partnered up with the local public broadcaster Televisión Pública in Argentina, and they co-produced documentaries. So the Chinese produced a documentary about Argentina, and the Argentinians one about China. So in this way, Argentinians were also, in a way, engaging audiences in China by gaining agency on how their own country is being shown to Chinese audiences. So this is quite an interesting case. And the second one in Brazil, in this case, it was a documentary co-production between the BRICS countries, and one of them is Brazil. And from that, which they produced the first film, which is Kids and Glory, about football, about children as well. And that was taken and developed into a second project, which was about Brazil. And there the embassy, the Brazilian embassy in China, also sponsored this documentary because they had a Chinese person, a Chinese presenter, go to Brazil and film a series of short films about Brazil in general, but focusing on football. So that's all I have for you today, and I hope you found it interesting. But I thought it was quite an interesting case of circling back to not just how China is acting in Latin America, but how Latin American governments are also jumping on the bandwagon and taking matters in their own hands and using their agency to also further their own public diplomacy interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. What a front row seat you have there, right? That's great. Well, we had some prearranged questions, but we have gotten so many great questions that were submitted from the audience before the webinar and also during the chat. So if it's all right with you, panelists, I'm going to claim moderator's privilege here and focus on some of the questions submitted in the chat or by the audience members that relate to some of the things we've talked about. And one of them that seems to be pretty popular, and I'm going to merge a couple questions together, is a question about what are the public diplomacy tools that are preferred by Latin American states? And you've talked about differences, a number of them. Is it diaspora communication? Is it someone asked about paid content? Someone else asked about branding, marketing, sport. And then Jerry, a question specifically to you that also ties in here is, what do you think of Twitter diplomacy? When yes, when no? So I will just throw that out. The focus is on strategies. What are you seeing? What are you thinking about the preferred strategies?
Well, I should first then. Actually, yes, absolutely, yes. Twitter diplomacy is a must these days. You need how to know to use it properly and what properly means. That's another thing. I don't mean I do know the answers, but definitely you need to communicate, and that's one of the most popular and so far-reaching instruments. Actually, we have dual accounts in the foreign ministry. I have my own personal account, but the foreign ministry has its Spanish account and its English account, and we try to feed both in real time because we see that the audiences far beyond Latin America are also demanding. The main challenge, again, is interaction, engagement, because we need to have human resources ready to reply every single consultation or comment, not the haters or the lovers. I mean, the actual consultations or inquiries we receive through social media. But it's the means to convey what you're doing and try to set your foreign policy goals. The digital diplomacy as the generic term, right? But public diplomacy is not just limited to digital diplomacy. That's usually a confusion. That's why I like talking about digital public diplomacy, because we have other initiatives, public diplomacy initiatives, which are not digital. But as far as digital is concerned, Twitter and these days TikTok and Instagram, the languages are different, what you convey is different, but it helps a lot to promote your country image. And I think when we diplomats are posted abroad, that resource, social media, is far more useful because you actually have more time and resources to interact and engage with the local audience. But I don't want to dwell on this because I like to hear what my colleagues say too of this. Thank you.
Vanessa, I'll just say, you focus a lot on diasporas. Is your focus there? And you gave us some great insights into what's intriguing you right now. But in terms of diaspora communication or as a tool of public diplomacy, how would that fit in with what you're seeing in terms of how public diplomacy strategies in Latin America?
Mm-hmm. So before we started the panel, we were talking about how in some cases scholars who conduct research see it from the outside, right? We are not practicing it. So it might be that people who are actually diplomats might have other insights as well. But again, seeing it from an outsider perspective, I tend to check a lot official communication channels and what in strategic communications are called information subsidies, and also social media. And I think that ministries of foreign affairs, embassies, consulates are doing a much better job than years ago in terms of communicating strategically and more often on social media, and doing it pretty well, I would say. Where I see inconsistencies is even when you follow these accounts on social media through different means, in many cases you read something because these are short posts, you read something and you're interested, and then you want to go and get more information. So usually what people do is they read the post, there might be a link, they go to the website. And then the websites is where I find very big differences in terms of how well or not the countries are communicating there, because not only different countries have different availabilities of information and how consistently they, for instance, update their information, but I have realized that changes in government also impact a lot, sometimes the quality of the information. So there have been countries where, and again, and if we have people from El Salvador here, they might agree or disagree, but I thought that in the previous government, it was much easier to find information about what the government was doing in terms of diplomacy in general, in terms of public diplomacy in particular, and in terms of policies and in terms of resources. With the most recent government in El Salvador, I have seen many areas of the website not to be there anymore or not to be as complete as in the past. So I think people still need to go to the more consistent sources of information, not just the posts. And there is where I don't see sometimes like a strategy. You sometimes it feels disconnected, and especially disconnected from one administration to the next within the same government. The other place where I think politicians are using more intentional communication to convey messages and priorities is in their press releases, in their speeches, being more again conscious of what they are saying and how they are saying it. But I think, again, Mexico much better than most countries in Latin America. Still, for example, I was checking today the website because I was checking a few details for this presentation, and I was checking the Institute for Mexicans Abroad and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores. And so they have an office of diplomatics, public diplomacy strategy. And I went to check to be sure that I was not going to say something today that was not true anymore. The link doesn't work, etc. Right? So when you go to the sources, the main sources of information, I still think they are lacking in some cases. Some countries much better than the others, but I think, and this is still digital because it's websites, but I think now websites are a little bit more traditional, but you still need to have good meat there, and sometimes that's not the case.
All right, thank you so much. Pablo, thinking about digital social media, I want to get your thoughts generally, but also perhaps you could speak to the ways China is engaging in Latin America and using these new tools.
Yes. So while I was hearing about Jerry and Vanessa, the first thing that came into my mind is that, yes, of course, China is also expanding onto social media, even though many of the social media platforms that are available everywhere else in the world are not here in China. So they're still using those platforms because they are very popular in every other country. And what happens sometimes is that many of the ambassadors have become very vocal, even in Latin America. And there was a very interesting case that relates also to one of the cases that I was talking before, which is the during the pandemic, there was the co-production of Mundo China that I just mentioned before, which is CCTV, the Chinese broadcaster, and Band News, so Bandeirantes Group, which is one of the main broadcasters in the country. During the pandemic, there was a domestic politics kind of a scandal where Bolsonaro's son, which is a member of the parliament in Brazil, criticized China because of the handling of COVID. And then the ambassador became very vocal on social media, on Twitter, engaging in we could say a fight on Twitter with different politicians. And what happened that caught the attention of many observers was that this news channel that partnered up with the Chinese, so Pan News TV, they issued an editorial which was actually defending China. And that was kind of eye-opening in the sense that, okay, you have a partnership with the Chinese media that is owned and controlled directly by the Chinese government. What does that tell about your news organization? And you could see all the comments from many viewers in Brazil thinking that, well, this channel must have been bought by Chinese capital. And it is the assumption, even until today, of many people throughout Brazil, that this is a channel directly controlled by China. So we have, on the one side, this public diplomacy strategy of trying to partner up with local media to gain more reach to broader audiences in the country. And on the other side, the actions and the activity of the ambassadors through Twitter that go on a different line and create unwanted consequences in the case of China, because that created a backlash from the public against China. So it didn't help them in improving their image. Quite the contrary, it worsened the image of China and that of the local partner. And if I may, just a couple of minutes, just some anecdotal information that relates to what Vanessa was talking about, the actions and the activities of Latin American countries. Now that I'm here in China, I get access and exposure to the activities of some of these Latin American countries and how they are engaging audiences through social media, Chinese social media. And one of the most used platforms, there are two, but one of the most used is WeChat. And on my very anecdotal observation, I can see that one of the most active countries in engaging with the audiences is Mexico. So it kind of aligns with what Vanessa was saying. They are not just promoting their own activities and getting people to go to the consulate, watch films. They also engage in partnering up with different consulates throughout the city of Guangzhou, where I'm based right now. For example, there is a Ibero-American film festival. So they have many of the consulates from different parts of Latin America, from Brazil, Argentina, but also Spain, Portugal, Mexico, etc. And they all come together and they present these films from the region, but this is done in the headquarters of the Mexican consulate.
Interesting.
May I add something there? That's super interesting because I didn't mention, but obviously person-to-person activities are still very important, cultural diplomacy. And it's true in the United States, I would say around the country, but I live in North Carolina. So the consulate of Mexico in Raleigh is kind of the consulate of Mexico and Central America, because they have all these activities that are really targeted at Mexicans who live in North Carolina. But they become kind of the consulate of the region because they are open to people from other countries, and not only the film festivals or the more cultural aspects, but trainings, webinars, legal support. And so they do a good job. And that's why I'm concerned. I guess that's why I went into this other topic, a little bit less positive, because I really admire what Mexico has done with public diplomacy. And for so many years, they started thinking of this and developing policy and developing institutions and a structure and a system decades before other countries in the region. But I am just concerned about how now, from the standpoint of reputation, with this tendency to not be so nice to immigrants from other countries. And I understand that the problem is very difficult and immigration it's a very complex process. But I wonder, and this is actually perhaps my question to people from Mexico or people who know of Mexico in this panel, and I know that it's not open that way, but I wonder how how do they perceive this newer, because it has taken years, but this newer tendency of defending your connationals, but at the same time kind of trying to stop immigration processes from other countries, right? Because it's a little ironic, or it makes me in a way question this defense of human rights for some, but not for others, right? So just wanted to add that. But the cultural diplomacy and the role that consulates play in the case of Mexico, not only for their connationals, but for the region, is very evident. Yeah.
Thank you, Vanessa. Jerry, I'm going to come back to you with a practice question, and because of timing, I'm going to toss 2 or 3 of the questions from the panel or from the audience together. The larger question was how the role of diplomats has changed in recent years, and then tied with that, what are the biggest challenges, which would perhaps bring in what some of Vanessa is talking about. What are the biggest challenges that diplomats, public diplomats particularly, are encountering? And maybe there's an assumption in this question that maybe disinformation might also be one of those challenges, and how are public diplomats addressing this? And then I'm going to add one more, and that is, are other foreign ministries in Latin American countries also enhancing their public diplomacy operations to address some of these challenges that you're facing?
Oh, thank you.
And I know that's a lot, so you can pick any of that you'd like.
My friend, but yeah, I do think the other ministries in the region are working hard. Mexico, Brazil, Peru, and many others, with different paces, but still. And the main challenges for us diplomats is it all depends on your not your age, but your proneness, your attitude in favor or against social media, because that is the main realm in which public diplomacy develops, honestly, these days. And you need to be digital. I have written articles calling for digital disruption in diplomacy. I think we do need to be trained and alerted, if that's a word my senior colleagues want to use, on the benefits that we diplomats may extract from public diplomacy in general and digital public diplomacy in particular. It's very cheap as a means, because every embassy has budgetary restrictions at any stage, be it in the European country, Latin American country. That's something we all share. So that's a very inexpensive, perhaps more polite, inexpensive way to promote your country, to engage with population, to convey your foreign policy goals. Actually, in Washington, D.C., I had the chance to witness myself cultural diplomacy, what Pablo was referring to, the Ibero-American cultural festivals. It was a huge thing, not only restricted to Latin Americans. We had also the same with the Nordics. And it was not just culture. We tried to make it cross-cutting. Through culture, you could promote your wine, and through wine, you could promote your dance and your tech. So you could, sum up a lot of what your country has to offer. In the case of Argentina, we are traditionally associated with our beautiful tango, our great Malbec, and amazing beef, which is fine. But we also have satellites, we have oil, we have so many things, space industry, nuclear energy. So the main challenge is to deal with unusual audiences. We diplomats were not trained to deal with the public in general. We need to speak with people, and not only our people, but people abroad. We need to use new channels besides the non-verbal and memoranda we're used to writing and cables. We need to use a different language, because if I speak through Twitter or through Instagram, the way I write my memos, nobody would understand. So that is the main challenge, to adapt your mindset to the current state of affairs, not be afraid, and make the best of both worlds, as I always say. The traditional diplomacy, which needs to be here face-to-face, is basic. You need trust, but at the same time, you do need to combine that with the digital world that opens up through Twitter, Instagram, and it's a whole world at your feet. So that will be basically my conclusion. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We only have 5 more minutes. And so I'm just going to open up again to Pablo to see if you'd like to add anything to what Jerry's saying about challenges, disinformation.
Yes. So one of the main concerns, and I'll refer to one of the questions that I saw in the panel here on this side, that has to do with paid content in media, in local media. So Chinese paid content in local media. That is something that doesn't happen just in Latin America, but everywhere else in the world as well. And that has been one of the other strategies that has been, in a way, easier to place content once you pay for it. In some cases, this is well labeled, and you can see that says this is paid content by X or Y. So it would say by China, by Chinese government, or something similar. In other cases, this is less so apparent, and in those cases, it becomes something that might be problematic if we look at the big picture, because we get a message that we don't know who has constructed it, and the content of which can be construed as propaganda, as trying to persuade populations of messages that might be at odds with messages from other media organizations. So that is something that is concerning and has already been on the radar of many politicians and policymakers, particularly in the US and in Europe, with respect to Chinese content placement. But in those countries, is much more frequent that this content will be labeled. In the case of Latin America, I think some countries are now waking up, or at least paying attention to these that might become an issue. And I'm talking particularly of prominent countries, if I could use that term to refer to Brazil, and for instance as well Chile. In other countries, the information sometimes is presented and there's no label, there's not even a mention of a source as coming from China. And as I said before, that could become problematic, and it's something that we should be paying attention to. And if you're interested, I think Igor Patrick has done a really good job in his book by documenting what is happening right now. The book just came out now in February, so it's very new, and I guess many will be quite interested because he focuses on this phenomenon in particular.
Great, thank you. Vanessa, do you want the final word?
Well, that's a lot of responsibility. No, I wanted to say that there are countries that have understood that communicating with publics abroad matters, and that, again, coming back to diasporas, because that's the area that matters to me the most, that communicating with diasporas matters in particular because we have an investment in our countries of origin where we can provide political support, where we can provide financial support, where whether we are not thinking of the government or anything, but we are sending back money to our families or keeping bank accounts or thinking that we are going to return. So there is an investment that governments should be putting. However, talking about disinformation, there are discouraging tendencies where, and I'm speaking for my country of origin in particular, where you see communications on social media that of course are going to be read by citizens of the home country, but also by people from that country who are all around the world, where governments, and again, I'm talking about my home country, are paying media outlets or are paying what we call trolls, based in my home country, but also, well, suddenly sometimes these kind of trolls forget that they are tweeting, for instance, on behalf of someone else, and they forget, and they end up coming with their names and locations in Vietnam, so there's a lot of information that is not organically produced, and that is being, again, paid for, and that is trying to support initiatives that might not have the support that they are supposed to have, right? So there is a bunch of things happening that models or that makes the situation more shady.
Thank you. Well, I think we all agree the challenges are many. But if we end on a positive note, Jerry, especially exciting to hear that there are more emphasis, more resources placed on public diplomacy in your work in other areas, other countries in the region. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Everybody out there, please join me in thanking our amazing panelists. Thank you all for joining us too in the audience. And before we wrap up, if you look in the chat, just want to announce a couple presentations coming up. If you would like to hear more about public diplomacy, the ICA International Conference on Communication and Global Human Rights is in the Gold Coast of Australia, and that is June 20th and 24th. But a little sooner than that, just next week in Washington, D.C., for all you folks who are fortunate enough to be there, USC is hosting an event at their Capitol campus. And the event is titled Understanding and Combating Disinformation in Public Diplomacy. And that is a place where this conversation, I am sure, will continue. And they'll have a reception and networking going on there as well. Again, I could sit here all day, listen to all three of you and engage in this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights. And we'll look forward to future conversations.